Hey everybody, this is Maxine Taylor with another edition of Move Into the Magic, and my guest, once again as promised, is Dr. Rocco Errico. And the reason he is back today is because the last time I interviewed him, he promised to come back and talk about a topic that I know everyone is interested in. We're going to call it God, Sexuality, and the Bible. That's a lovely, innocuous title. Wait till you hear what he has to say. If you have not watched any of our other videos, let me give you just a brief background on who Dr. Rocco Errico is. He is a PhD and a THD. He is the founder and president of the Noura Foundation in Smyrna, Georgia. And I'm going to give you that contact information now because we won't have time once he gets going. The phone number is 678-945-4006. And the website is Noura, I'll spell that for you, Noohra, Noura.com. Rocco Errico is truly a brilliant teacher. He is internationally known. I heard him speak over a decade ago, and I never forgot the man. His brilliance stayed with me. He tells us what is really in the Bible, what the Bible is really about. And of course, the first thing he said from the podium when I heard him speak was that God did not write the Bible. With that, I'm going to turn the show over to Rocco Errico. He is going to share his wisdom on God, sexuality, and the Bible. He's got a wonderful video set of CDs and DVDs that he will share with you. Rocco, welcome and take it away.
Thank you, Maxine. You know, what you just said about God didn't write the Bible. I always tell people, no, he did not take the pen out of the hands of the scribes to write the book we call Holy Bible. In fact, this is a term we gave this name of these books, 66 books. And God did not write it. It was human beings who wrote it that had experiences what we call God. And that's what makes the difference, you see. You have to understand that. So when you understand that a human being or scribes were the ones who were instrumental in writing the scriptures, then you must take into consideration the language, idiomatic expressions, the culture, the mysticism, and all the background when you're reading it. But people don't do that. They read it surfacely. And this is why we have such a terrible misunderstanding about human sexuality, because we do not see it from a proper perspective. In fact, a lot of what we call religious people have what I call erotophobia, fear of eroticism, fear of masturbation, fear of homosexuality, fear of even heterosexuality, fear of, unless you do it a certain way. I'm talking about heterosexuality. I mean, we have put such a blanket of fear on human sexuality and then put God's name on top of it and then try to back it with the Bible. In other words, we make ourselves bigoted and prejudiced, and we start to grow hatred and resentment in things that God never intended, nor did the Hebrew writers, nor those of the New Testament either. In fact, the first time I did a seminar, I called it, and it took 10 hours, you realize, to discuss human sexuality, God, and the Bible. I did a 10-hour seminar. I did it over a 3-day period in Atlanta, Georgia, at Hillside International Truth Center. This was years ago, but we taped it. And I thought, how am I going to condense what I said in here? So what I did, I wrote a little something, and this is the disc set on God, human sexuality, in the Bible. And this is what I wrote because I wanted the people to get what I was after. And so it says, sexuality is one of the most powerful forces on earth. It is the phenomenon of life. We'd have no life without it.
Right.
None. And yet many religions have sought to suppress, imprison, and control this natural God-given force we call sex. And Christianity, from St. Augustine, or perhaps even from the Apostle Paul, have attempted to cordon off our erotic nature. This illuminating lecture series brings clarity and understanding to many misunderstood biblical passages concerning sexual expression. Dr. Errico explores the depths of human sexuality from a spiritual perspective, conveying its healing and loving aspects. This is what I did in it. And that's what we're going to talk about. The healing and loving aspects of sex. And how does that come about? And how do we heal erotophobia? And where does erotophobia come from? Those are the ideas I like to deal with in today's topic on human sexuality and the Bible. And that is, how did we, what does it mean, erotophobia? It means we fear sex. In other words, unless it meets a prescribed way we are told, then it should be feared. Now, you do have to understand that promiscuity and things like this, that when it gets out of control, it can be dangerous to your health. To your health. So we're not talking about that aspect of it. We're talking about the expression of human sexuality, okay?
Yes.
So number one, where does erotophobia come from? What is it based on? Why do we have this in us? Because it was taught us. We're taught about erotophobia right from the beginning of when we're children. And so where does this start? It starts with what I call somaphobia. Now, these are Greek terms. Erotophobia, somaphobia, these are Greek words. Soma means body. And phobia means fear.
Yes.
So erotophobia is based and builds on fear of the body. Because the body has appetites, the body has sensuality, the body has all these things. So the first thing we want to do is control it. Control it, see? And so religion, that's why religion seeks to suppress it. And they've taken certain scriptures that even the original writers, when they wrote it, did not intend what we have done with it, see? It's interpretation of scripture. And we have to go right to, even though I touched on different facets, which we will go into those different facets. But I think let's start with right away with heterosexuality. Okay, and where do we get even that? Some people feel condemned in heterosexuality, even a husband and wife. They only do it to have children because the church teaches that.
Right.
In other words, if you do it just for pleasure, but you see, it's more than just pleasure. Love is expressed through it. So religion then put a corners, boxed it in and said, this is the only reason for you to have it. Well, it doesn't make sense because the sexual drive starts in us when we're children.
Yes.
Right away. And in some children, even there's different measures of human sexuality. Some people it's really, really strong in. Some people it's in between. And some people not too strong. And then some are what I call asexual. In other words, they can take it or leave it.
Right.
And there are people who are that way. That's the way their makeup is. But we're talking about now the body. And we always have feared the body. because of its appetites, because of its sensuality. Now I'm going to tell you something else. Because the body is sensual, and we think of, now I'm going to have to get into the female gender, because if we think of the female gender as totally sensual, which it is because they really, really feel, we think more of male, although the males feel too, but the females seem to have an extrasensory touch when it comes to sensuality and when it comes to the understanding even of psychic things, you know. So, and I'm speaking in general terms. I'm not speaking that this is set. This is general terms.
Right.
But you have to understand this. And because a woman, or the gender, female, being sensual, this is another reason why she's put under the male. It's for control. It's for control, you see.
Yes.
And we make the male superior. And in the Near Eastern culture, especially the ancient world, now we're talking about, and some even that's prevalent today, that's why you have people like ISIS that has no understanding of a human being, especially a female.
Yes.
And they can make slaves of them,
Yes.
make them, you know, just all kinds of things with the female.
Yes.
And it still prevails in our culture too, prevails not in sex, but in money. But it's rooted back to sex. Do you understand? The reason why women cannot make the same salary is because of their sex. Woman. You see, what does this have to do with human? It has plenty to do with it, because it comes from the Bible and it comes from the church. Religion. Religion has cordoned off our sexual forces and have boxed it in and have played havoc with us. It plays havoc with our politics.
Yes.
It plays havoc with our money, with our business, with everything. So male, female. So erotophobia comes from somophobia, you know, which is fear of the body. And what worst thing about the body, it has appetites and it's sensual, right?
Right.
We sense everything, we feel everything, see? So that's where that comes from. So the first thing we read, first I want to clarify it. The original revelation and understanding of human sexuality is in the first chapter of Genesis, where God says, and I love it, because it is so typically Semitic, where God says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Huh?
Uh-huh.
And there's only one way to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And that is by having sexuality. So it was God's blessing on it. God's blessing on human sex. So the first thing we got to realize is that there is a blessing on human sexuality. Now, the major idea behind it in Genesis, fill the earth, was to populate it.
Right.
And when this was written, we got to understand now, there's two episodes. The first episode is the creation of human beings, right? And the second and third chapters is Adam and Eve's story. We've got to separate them. Do not put them together, but we have. But I'll get to Adam and Eve in a minute. So in that very first chapter, it's the blessing. And when was it written? The first chapter, believe it or not, people think that was the first thing that was written. No, it wasn't. It wasn't, according to what scholars tell us, and according to what research has done on it. The first chapter of Genesis was written in the 6th century BC or BCE, 6th century. The Adam and Eve story, which is the second and third chapter, was written in the 10th century BCE. But when they put it together as a book, this became that 6th century revelation of creation became, the first story. And then the second one, Adam and Eve. But chronologically, it's the opposite.
Wow.
So, in other words, there was a change in consciousness. 10th century was giving a different idea. 6th century was giving another idea. It lifted men. You see, I wish I had time to teach that, but I'll be getting away from sexuality if I do, to explain how that first chapter came and why it was written. It was to uplift us, not put us down. The writer did not know we were going to get into argument over over creation,
Yes.
over Darwin and all the other stuff, because he had the idea of exalting human beings. That's all I want to say about that. So the idea now, sex is mentioned in it when he said, be fruitful and multiply, because there were constant wars. At that time, Babylon had ruled the world. Persia was ruling the world, So the population was not that much, and they only thought of the Near East. They didn't know about the rest of the world. So the first thing was that it was to reproduce. Now, you got to keep this in mind. It was to have children. This is why later on, the church later on picked it up and says, the only reason you're to have sex, or if you do anything to prevent having children, you've committed a sin. This is not true. Where did they get from? There's no place in the Bible that says if you prevent yourself from having a child, you've committed sin. That is a lie, and it comes straight from the church. It's a falsehood, and it puts condemnation in us, see. No, we are drawn by it, attracted by it, wanting it, see. We express our love, our care for someone when you have sexual union. And of course, children are born out of love, but sometimes they're born out of an accident too. They didn't, right? But you still love them, right? And there's no such thing as an illegitimate child, because this is the only way children can come into this world. We only call it illegitimate because they didn't have a marriage certificate.
Right.
And that is another falsehood that was put on human beings. Any child born in this world, whether they went through wedlock or not, God said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. At the moment they have sexual congress like that, when there's that joining and they have a child, whether they're married or not, that child is a child of God, because God put a blessing on that act. Do you get it?
Yes.
Okay, so we cleared the first thing about heterosexuality. It doesn't mean I'm going around jumping on everybody, where I get into trouble. But I want them to get the real behind the scenes. We're going behind the scenes. So it has blessing on it. And the only reason why I talk like this is because religion has taught us the opposite.
Yes.
Taught us the opposite of it. So now we go to the Adam and Eve story. And in the Adam and Eve story, the way it's been interpreted, and there's three major interpretations of the Adam and Eve story. Of course, the major one that we've always heard from when we were children is that Adam and Eve had sex. And that was the sin that they committed. No, it does not. It had to do with the tree. And this is a story, folks. Please. It's a story. It never happened. God never set up a tree and said, don't touch it, because he knew that's the first thing we'd go for. Just like wet paint. It tells you, touch me, doesn't it? Even wet paint is a signal for you to go up and touch it. You're drawn to it. It's like a magnet. No, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and I taught on that once before in one of your programs. I don't want to go into that, but it has nothing to do with human sexuality. Adam and Eve were already having sex before they ever touched the tree. I mean, remember, we find out later that they were naked, right?
Right.
Right. And because after they ate of the tree, then they realized they were naked and they tried to cover up. But they were naked beforehand, and they could see the difference between a male and a female.
Right.
And what do you think they're going to do? They're going to investigate, right? And not only that, they see all the animals copulating. All the animals are copulating all around. If you're going to go by the whole story, see, what we have here is a condensation. That is, they condensed that story into a very short story. It must have been a longer story. We just didn't get it. In fact, most of the stories from Genesis, the first chapter, to the 11th chapter, most of the stories are condensed stories. In other words, the scribes took ancient stories, rewrote them, and condensed it. So we don't have the whole story. That's why so much of it is incomplete, Like, where did Cain get his wife? You know, if Adam and Eve were the only ones around, who was he afraid of? You see? So, but I don't want to get into that. I'm just trying to open up the scriptures from God, human sexuality, and the writers of the Bible. These scribes took these condensed stories. So they were already copulating, talking about Adam and Eve, before they took of the tree, the fruit of the tree. It's a symbolic story. You know, no tree can give you knowledge. No fruit can give you knowledge. It's a symbol. It's a metaphor.
Yes.
The tree is a metaphor, see? And that's why they took it to mean sex. No. Not at all. The first chapter says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. How else are we going to do it?
Right.
That's the only way to fulfill that divine blessing. So, what do we have here? Adam and Eve, it had nothing to do with sex, and yet it's been handed down. What the Adam and Eve story is doing is establishing normal Near Eastern cultural ways of expression. In other words, it is sanctioning cultural norms. Because once they committed and ate of that fruit, then God put certain things on them. Man now has to work by the sweat of his brow. Woman is going to have difficulty in giving birth. But these are things that were happening all the time. So what they did is they created a story to sanction these normal things that happen. God never cursed the woman in having children, that she would have difficulty. There's a physiological reason why sometimes there's difficulty in childbirth.
Right.
See, but in the ancient world, everything is attributed to God. Everything is attributed to God. So heterosexuality is a blessing. It has a blessing on it. But what about all the other expressions that we find in the Bible? I think as we move through the Bible, before we get to that book called Leviticus, what we call the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There are stories before we get to Leviticus. In Leviticus, we have what we call the holiness code. In other words, how to conduct your sexual life, how to conduct what you should eat, how you should conduct, how you bring your offerings to God in the temple. In other words, ritualism and sacrifice, how you're supposed to bring your animal. And why did they even bring animals? Why did God need an animal?
Really?
I mean, there's so many things we can get into, but I can't. I'm trying to stick on the theme of sexuality. So before we get to Leviticus and all the do's and don'ts of sexual behavior, there's one more story in Genesis that we need. Well, there's two or three, but I'm going to get to this one. That's very important. It's the story of a man who slept with his sister-in-law. He had to, because his brother died, and there was the law of the ancient Near East was, if your brother dies before he has an offspring, a male offspring, that the other brothers will be responsible to sleep with her, and it's a special law to sleep with her and bring forth a male child for the brother, so the name doesn't die out. See,
right.
All right. So he slept with her, but when he was having intercourse with her, the Bible has sexual stories in it. It tells you right there. When he was having intercourse with her, he pulls out. And it says, spilled his seed on the ground. They called semen seed because they didn't understand how it worked. They thought the man had the seed, just like when you take seeds and plant it in the ground. And they thought the woman was a garden. That's another. The woman was the garden, and the man was the one who put the seed in there. That's why it's called seed. He spilled his seed on the ground. And this is where we get the story of masturbation. Because he actually was practicing what we call in Latin, coitus interruptus.
Yes.
Yeah. And where it spills it on the ground. So what we have here then is, people made up the story that this is masturbation. No. It had to do with intercourse and not raising a child for his dead brother. And then the next line says, and God slew him. What? You mean because he practiced coitus interruptus, God slew him? No. This is the ancient scribal writer, the author, scribal author. Because what happened is later on, he became sick. His name is Onan, and it was called Onanism, which later on became masturbation, see. But he wasn't masturbating. He just didn't want to raise a child for his dead brother. And it was called Onanism, from Onan. But he became sick, and he passed away. So they figured, well, God did it. Because anything that happened in the Near East, this was the ancient belief system. Anything, because they had no devil to blame. So what they had was God. So God is controlling everything, and he died, and he didn't raise an offspring for his brother, so God punished him. You see the belief system? It says, and God slew him. But God doesn't slay anyone of it. You know how many people practice coitus interruptus or even use a condom that stops it? Same thing. That's the same thing. Why isn't God slaying everybody? Come on now. I see our time is almost up. So all I wanted to clarify, that we've done a lot of clarification here. Genesis, the first story, the Adam and Eve story, and the story of Onanism. God does not bring sickness and illness upon human beings because of certain sexual practices. And we'll get into the others later.
And we certainly will. We're going to continue with our next show, which will follow on the heels of this one. We've got to get into Leviticus because I can hear the whole LGBT community talking about whatever happened to Leviticus. So everybody stay tuned because Dr. Errico has so much more to share with us. And he gave us the background. And in our next segment, we will talk about Leviticus. Leviticus is where it's at as far as I'm concerned. So next time, stay tuned. And may the stars shine brightly on you and yours.